Well, we have a lot of stuff this morning, so we'll go ahead and get going here. We're in chapter 20. We're going to cover the first part of chapter 20. We haven't been putting a schedule on because we've been kind of going at it one chapter at a time. But here, I thought I'd put this up because we're beginning to break it up a little bit. So Wednesday, we're going to cover the second half of chapter 20. Then next Sunday, first part of 21, and then the next Wednesday, April 26th, the second part of chapter 21. And then we're going to hold off chapter 22 till the end. I felt like, and I talked this over with Lawrence a little bit, I felt like 22 is a nice way to end, rather than doing it as kind of a review. Let John finish the book for us. But in between, we're going to have 3 classes on things that we've already touched on, but focus on them a little more in detail. One of the things we're going to do here in chapter, and we already started at 19. Well, I'll come back to that. Okay. I want to set up chapter 20, so get us thinking in certain ways, and we've done this as we've gone through the book some, but think about key events in the unfolding of the gospel. And so if I ask you, what are some critical events in the unfolding of the gospel, the revelation of the gospel, the good news? Jesus' death, his life before that, his resurrection, I think this morning, his ascension. So I put some of these up here. Those things are the core, but does it end there? Oh, then Pentecost. Well, all right, the gospel message is proclaimed at Pentecost. The apostles have put it together. Well, there it is. That's the gospel story. Well, again, most of you know the book of Acts. What are some other things that begin unfolding in Acts?
It goes to the Gentiles.
Right, it goes to the Gentiles. We see Cornelius. We see even before the Gentiles, because of this persecution in Jerusalem, they go everywhere, Samaria first and then all over the place. Saul is converted. He becomes his instrument for spreading it all over the Roman world. Cornelius, we mentioned, and then on and on. The reason I mention this is, yes, there are these events that happen at point in time or over short periods, like Jesus' life or his death. We often think of, well, here's the gospel message on Pentecost. And so that message is already established, but and that's why I use the word unfolding. Does that mean, well, that's it? That's all there is to essentially the story? Well, no, there's a lot more to the story. In one way, are things in Acts brand new? Is the message brand new? Well, no, but the idea that we're pulling in the Gentiles, that's a new element. And I want us to see chapters in Revelation as a whole, 19 and 20, as this sort of unfolding of the message. That many of the things that are described, and you would read Revelation 19 or 20, think, well, this is brand new. But it's really just a new chapter in the unfolding of the message. We've talked about this before a little bit. Was Jesus King of Kings and Lord of Lords when he ascended? Well, yes. But does that negate the idea that in Revelation now we have this wedding feast and he's proclaimed king? Well, no, this is a new chapter in the story that relates to new events here on earth, right? And so we've seen this progression in these latter chapters, this destruction of the prostitute, adulterous city, breaking its covenant, and we've leaned toward the idea, or maybe more than leaned, but kind of forwarded the idea that that's Jerusalem. And then we have this wedding feast of the Lamb, the rider on the white horse. Lawrence talked about this Wednesday. I thought really did a good job of emphasizing this point. What's coming out of the mouth of the rider on the white horse? sword. And what is the sword here? The word, the message. And what ends up happening with that sword? Well, the beast, the prophet, are defeated by the rider with the sword coming out of its mouth. I think that it's a really important way of viewing this, that often people want to get very hyper-literal with chapters 19 to 20, start viewing, oh, there's going to be a battle and they're going to be whacked down. But I think the metaphors here speak to this idea of the message overwhelming the beast and the false prophet. And one of the things that's important, I think, in thinking through this, while most things of Revelation are not literal, that doesn't mean they're not sensical. Sometimes we almost begin thinking, well, if they're not literal, then it can mean whatever. Well, that's not. There's a sense to the symbolism that's used here. Now, I do think one thing, Lawrence and I think are in agreement on this, that begins happening while the focus in much of Revelation, especially these chapters from 6 through 11, and it's sort of, as we've suggested, retelling many of the same events, but through different symbols. While that focuses on a fairly short time period, we're not trying to shoehorn everything in Revelation into sort of 66 to 70 AD. That I think that there is a longer horizon that especially begins to emerge here in chapters 5 to 20, like the overcoming of the beast. Well, how long, if the beast, and again, exactly how the beast is used in different ways in the book. Nero is the beast, made of the Roman Empire. But how long is that taking to overcome, through the message, overcoming the Roman Empire? A couple hundred more years. That's not something that's all occurring right within the lifetime of these people. But it would have been a message to these 7 churches and the people in them of hope. What Rome seems like, the Lord's talking with us tonight, you would have thought this is invincible. If you're Chinese and living in China, you would think, well, who can stand up against this? Well, the Lord is saying the message is going to defeat the enemies. So we get into 20, and I would encourage us to think about, I don't think everything in 20 is just overlapping, but there are many things in chapter 20 that, again, are not sequential in nature, but are describing in new ways things that we've already talked about in chapter 19. Now, again, I think he does get into some new things, and he answers 2 main questions I think that would have been of interest to these people, these 7 churches. Well, you've been talking about the dragon, you've been talking about Satan. What about him? We have it, he hasn't been dealt with. He's ultimately the author of the evil at the root level. And what about these saints that were under the altar that were mentioned way back in chapter 6 that we've talked about? All right. And in terms of Satan in Revelation, you might think of him, I didn't know what the right word was, so his status, his phases in Revelation. He's sort of existing here and portrayed as being he's been put in the abyss. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But chapter 19, he's released from this abyss. And then in chapter 12, we have this warning. So he's released from the abyss. He seems to have a heavenly type power because you have this war in heaven. And Michael and angels throw down the great dragon. But he goes where? Not back to the abyss, he goes to earth. And then chapter 20, we're going to see him in the first part that he's bound. And then in the second part, this put into this burning lake of sulfur. So we have this, again, this progression of Satan and his position, status through the book. And I want to mention, if we went back and said, all right, well, why was he in the abyss to begin with in chapter 9? Again, this is sort of this unfolding of a story. Well, what happened in the lifetime of Jesus? I gave you a quick. If you're a speed reader, you already have it. But well, chapter 12 in Matthew and in Luke 10, he makes reference to that Jesus, when he was here on the earth, what was he doing in terms of Satan's power? Subduing it, ultimately conquering the power of death and sin on the cross and the resurrection. But even before that, showing it in sort of both a literal and symbolic way of healing these people that had been overtaken by demons. It appeared as Satan seemed to have been given some extra leeway in this period, partly to show Jesus' power. And he says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. And I have given you authority, he says, to his followers, to overcome all the power of the enemy. And so I think the idea here is Jesus is tying him up, putting him in the abyss, and that's where we find him, and yet he's then released from this abyss. Right? So I think that's important because you see what Jesus is doing to Satan, but on the other hand, were bad things still happening in the world between 30 and 70 AD, or between 30 and 90 AD? Right, yeah. I mean, Jesus tying him up, Jesus is finding him, he's falling out of heaven like lightning, and yet, that's not saying he's totally without any realm or power. All right. And then, I'm not going to go through every one of these, but again, this unfolding story, what we see happening in chapter 19 with the rider and the sword and the message, well, it's conquering the beast now, but what had this sword already been doing? Well, as you can see, the message spread from Jerusalem and increased rapidly. The word of the Lord spread widely and grew in power. The gospel is bearing fruit and growing throughout the whole world. I love what Paul says in 2 Timothy 2. And if you've seen the movie, the Paul Apostle of Christ, I think they really use this powerfully. Remember Jesus Christ, raised from the dead, descended from David. This is my gospel, for which I'm suffering now, even to the point of being chained like a criminal. But the word of the Lord is not chained. Those we're going to see, somebody is chained. And so we have this sort of juxtaposition of the word, the sword, the message in its position and Satan's position. He talks in Acts 26 and made his presentation to Agrippa that he said, I was being sent to open the eyes of the Gentiles and to turn them from darkness by the power of Satan to God. Romans 16, all right, God is soon going to crush Satan under your feet. But that crushing is going to happen after Satan has had quite a bit of power and influence in the world. All right? And I wanted to, we've mentioned this, I know you're all aware of these souls under the altar, but I want to highlight a couple of things they were saying. I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been killed because they were faithful for the word of the Lord. And they crying out, you're the holy and true Lord, but how long until the people of the earth are punished for killing us? And again, thinking of this as a simple, but it doesn't mean it's nonsensical. Then each one of them was given a white robe and was told to wait a short time longer. Again, I do think time periods in Revelation are typically symbolic, but symbolic, again, doesn't mean there's no sense. And when he says things like short and shortly to come to pass, I don't think he means 2,000 years later, because they need to wait a short time, because during this period, what's going to happen? Where their fellow Christians are going to suffer, are going to be killed. The number of martyrs is not yet filled up, right? So, here we go. That's my background. So now you should be ready. I see exactly what chapter 20 is about, right? So, Floyd, could I get you to read the first 3 verses of chapter 20?
And I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal on him, so that he should not deceive the nations, or so that he should deceive the nations no more till 1,000 years were finished. But after these things he must be released for a little while.
So, I would encourage you, if you're going to study Revelation, start with chapter 20 and verse 1. I'm just joking. I'm afraid that often, not that this first place people read, but I'm afraid that sometimes the explanation of Revelation almost begins by working out the chapter 20. I think it makes much more sense if you see chapter 20 in context of what's been built up to this picture. I was joking Wednesday night that I had changed my mind on the kind of view of the city and all this, that now it's Russia and China. Well, this picture that I drew out of Satan being bound and chained was actually from a website that was really pushing the view that Russia and China are what Revelation is talking about. Gog and Magog. And we know that it's a dangerous thing to interpret the Bible through the news that's happening 2,000 years later. It's much more sensible to interpret what's being written through the news that was happening in 60-something or 90-something AD, not 2023. And so one of the things I want to highlight here, we continue throughout the book these references to Satan and the dragon and the devil. I just want to briefly ask, what he uses several terms here: the dragon, the ancient serpent, the devil, or Satan. Who is Satan? Lawrence over the years has really emphasized the phrase the accuser. I was looking up, and first part of this is from Wiktionary, but as I was reading up, I think they borrowed it pretty much from Oxford English Dictionary, but the Oxford English Dictionary had way too many words to try to fit in here. But it's a Hebrew word, and it's from a root relating to opposition or accusation, and so certainly it's legitimate to refer to them as the accuser. But like a lot of words, context, and then translating them to another language, context, where it gives you a sense maybe of what's it leaning toward, describes as a noun, Satan, adversary, opponent. Well, let me go on. The devil, if you read here, ultimately it was used by the Septuagint translators, that's what's meant by the LXX there, to translate in 200 or thereabout BC, to translate the Hebrew word Satan. They translated into the Greek word diabolos, from which then through Latin and we get devil. And so again, that kind of has the idea of accuser, slanderer. And then Revelation 12:9 is referred to as the deceiver of the whole world. Remember how James, I think it's James, refers to him? Maybe Peter. Father of lies. He's a liar from the beginning and the father of lies. And so you think, and slander and accuser are very, I think, closely connected here. Think about, he slanders or accuses Job. Who does he first? Where do we first see him slandering someone?
In the garden.
Who is it that he slanders? God. Right. I think, again, you can see this. I think the term slanderer makes sense here. But I think also this term adversary, I think opponent, maybe in the most general sense, think of Satan as the enemy or opponent of mankind. He is against us, and yet, how does he portray himself?
He's a liar.
Angel of light. In terms of humanity, how does he portray himself to us?
Desirable.
Desirable. There's a film where Satan takes on a human form and it's expressing, hey, you know, God's the one, as it says, setting up the rules in opposition to, you know, your desires. I've been encouraging and helping you feed. I've nurtured, I think he says in the film, I've nurtured every desire that mankind has had. I'm your friend. I've been down here with you. And think about it. That's Satan's ploy is, and you can see this in the world we live in. And Lawrence talked about this quite a bit. Just follow your instincts. Be who you are. You know, not encourage every feeling you have. Well, is Satan really helping us in that? No, he's destroying us. He's ultimately trying to destroy us as he's been destroyed. And so I think thinking about Satan in that way and his role in the whole book is useful. All right, we're going to come back to this, so I'm not going to leave it. Lawrence, would you read the next 3 verses?
I saw the thrones on which were seated those who had been given authority to judge. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony about Jesus and because of the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him for 1,000 years.
All right, so we've arrived at, you know, probably the most controversial and often talked about section of the book, the 1,000 years, the millennium. And first, you think about what has been said in the previous verses 1 through 3, and in these 3 verses. So what events are going, or what things are happening simultaneously during this 1,000 years? Satan is bound.
Saints are reigning.
The saints reign, right? And so I think it's important to know these saints. Who in the world are these saints that have been raised to reign? Yeah, letting the book make sense of itself. Again, thinking of the symbols not as nonsensical and disconnected. Who are these saints?
The martyrs.
The martyrs, where did we see them?
Under the altar.
Under the altar. Now, yeah, he uses a slightly different phrase, but I think it's all the souls of those who have been beheaded because of the testimony of Jesus and because of the word. That's almost verbatim the description of those souls under the altar. Who are these souls? If this was written in the 1st century, well, these people that have been killed because of their testimony, killed by the false prophet in the adulterous city, had been killed by the beast, who've been crying out, asking for redemption and vengeance and justice. You know, this was unjust. We're following the Lamb, the King, and we've been killed for it. And in fact, the reference here, this is, searching for different ways of representing this. This is a sculpture that's actually on Notre Dame Cathedral. And John guessed who it was. Who might guess this is depicting? John the Baptist. Yeah, that's those obviously, most of those who have been killed have been killed. Beheading here is symbolic Because unless you're a Roman citizen, you were unlikely to be beheaded. You were killed in not so swift ways. But think about it. Why was John killed? Well, Herod, his stepdaughter, and all that business. But ultimately, what got John in trouble? Telling the truth, preparing the way, being the messenger and the forerunner of Christ, his testimony about Jesus. And so he becomes, I think, in reference to those beheaded, he becomes, as we talked about, like Nero and the number 666, John becomes sort of the point person representing all of these souls under the altar. And so that had been told that they needed to wait, what? Just a little longer till some more were killed. And then they were going to be not 2,000 years, but a little longer. And so I think that gives us a real key to sensing. So this 1,000 years that Satan is bound, this 1,000 years, whatever it is a period where a little time has transpired since these people have been martyred, and then we're into this 1,000-year period. Now, here I put up probably the 4 leading views. There's sort of 2 versions of premillennialism. So when the millennium occurs, and I never can keep straight amillennialism, postmillennialism, and pre-tribulation. But just the idea of premillennialism is that there's going to be a literal 1,000-year millennium sometime in the future, and the 2 versions deal with whether Christians will be pulled out before this tribulation leading up to it or after. Postmillennialism and amillennialism are very similar in that they would both treat this as somewhat symbolic, although postmillennialism focuses on the idea that there'll be a real reign kind of after a while of building up to that. This is sort of the view that Lawrence and I are forwarding. The idea that we are living in the millennium. And the millennium began when? This 1,000 years, when these saints, what happened to them? Well, let's think about it. If you ask, what is this 1,000 years? Well, if you think about the book as a whole, what should you lean toward in terms of, is this literal or symbolic? Right. I mean, almost, not everything, almost everything in the book is symbolic. What events have transpired and led up to this 1,000 years? Well, we just talked about these saints that have been killed and crying out for justice. And then what happens to them? What's the symbolism? I don't think it's a literal resurrection. It's a symbolic. They're under the altar. Their souls are sort of in this state of being, I don't know, maybe the right word here. Yeah.
Well, they've been condemned by the state as criminals, and they're unvindicated, and their deaths have not been in any way justified.
Yeah. And so now, though, what happens? The city is destroyed. We see this on the sword overcoming the beast, the false prophet. They are vindicated. They are raised up to do what? Reign with Christ. Then I ask, what are the overlapping events identified in not just chapter 20 at the beginning, but in chapter 19? What else is going on as this 1,000 years is happening? Well, the message, the sword coming out of the rider's mouth, the message is spreading. Think about that. Doesn't that correspond with these saints now living and reigning with Christ? They've been vindicated through the message overcoming the enemies of Christ. And some of that, yes, some of that happens immediately if you think about the city being Jerusalem. But then this also happens over the next 200 years as the beast is overcome by the message. And this torturing, persecuting power eventually is brought down and embraces Christianity. Right? And then finally, if you think about this message not as written directly to us in 2023, but it's written to real people in 7 churches living in Turkey, and for use, and though they become again sort of symbolic of Christians all over living in this time, what meaning, what value would this have for these people? Who is being killed? Well, people they know, family members. You think about among us, people being plucked out and killed. And so the question, what about these people? What about their vindication? What about justice for them? What about these persecuted powers? Well, what meaning would this have if this is all 2,000, 3,000 years later? Well, that might still have some meaning. But he's writing this to give them comfort and solace and to give them hope and realize God is working it out. Right? So, but then that raises this question. And Lawrence, I think Lawrence taught this section 4 years ago, and it's one of the class members just outright asked, and I think it's a very good question. How could the millennium, these 1,000 years, how could that possibly describe the last 1,900 years? One of the things that Phil and I refer to is, Satan says, well, the 20th century was all mine. I don't think there's anybody disputing that. There are a lot of terrible things that have happened in the last 1,900 years. The continuing persecution of Christians, not just in the Roman Empire, but other places, even to this day. Continuing the things like the Black Plague in Europe and its waves. How many people died in World War II? Civilians and military. Estimates are 50 million. Maybe that many people died in the Spanish flu of 1918. I think, well, wait a minute. I thought Satan was bound. But I think, again, was Jesus binding Satan in his lifetime? Well, yes. Did that mean Satan had no influence and no power? I think you got to think about this not from the question, are bad things still happening, but from the standpoint of what is transpiring with the message. Here are some questions. One, keep in mind that this is symbolic and often hyperbolic, somewhat exaggerated language. Just like Jesus is using when he talks about binding the strong man. What about the spread of the gospel? So let's start thinking about the last 2,000 years. Not from the question, do bad things still happen, but from the standpoint of the message of the gospel. Think about it. In 66 or 92 AD, what would Christians have thought about the Roman Empire? And themselves. You think they could have ever envisioned the day that Rome would issue an edict saying, hey, Christians can worship their God? And yet, within 200 years or 250 years, that's exactly what happened. And to us, that's a little note in some history book. But think about it from the standpoint of somebody living under this oppressive world, whether the oppression of the Jewish authorities or the oppression of the Roman authorities. Think about how upside down that outcome is. And what has happened then? What about the spread beyond that? You know, we have through Eusebius and other post-Christian writers, we have at least some idea, exactly how accurate, we don't know, but some idea that the apostles spread out, maybe as far as India, maybe as far as Britain. You know, it's within the 2nd century, you know, we've mentioned Irenaeus. Where did Irenaeus live? He was a bishop in the city of what we call Lyon, France. Wait a minute. It's not just one of these coastal cities or cities of Asia Minor. What's the story of the last 2,000 years of the gospel? Growth. Where is the last, especially the last 30 years, the gospel's gone to an extent that it hasn't before? So I know through the efforts of people we have in this very room and many others who have borne great hardships and people living in China today. And like I said, does it seem that how in the world, you know, we can't envision exactly how this, you know, how are Christians in China ever going to get out from under this oppression? Any more than Christians in the 60s or 90s could have envisioned how are Christians going to get out from under this oppression? But is God going to win out and the message of Christ going to win out over powerful nations? And has it been doing that? Yes, it has. And then, besides the message, and Lawrence and Jared have both mentioned this, I've mentioned it too, this progressive impact of the gospel on culture and ethics, even among people who would deny Jesus as Lord and Christ. In this book, they've mentioned Dominion. It's long. It's a big commitment to read it. But the guy who wrote it, a British historian named Holland, isn't a Christian. And it was a trip to Iraq that he credits with beginning to make him realize, wait a minute, what I thought was just, this is the ethic people live by, you know, this is just the way we're born. He realized, no. And he began looking at this. Let me ask you, where Christianity has gone, and this in many places has taken years and years, but what percentage of the Roman world were slaves?
It's considered about half at one time were
Yeah.
slaves.
Yeah, maybe 1/3, half at lot. Where Christianity has gone and has a big influence, what eventually has happened to slavery on any wide scale? I mean, there's still human trafficking that goes under the radar here and there in the U.S. and other places. But in terms of government-sanctioned slavery, now again, and Holland notes this, Christians haven't always been true to these ideals, and he notes in chapters through from the first century on. But what about even more basic things? What about the idea? Paul writes this, and we take this as just, well, yeah, of course, husbands should love their wives. Husbands should be faithful to wives. What would have been the ethic prevailing in the Roman world? Oh, your wife is there for maybe manage the household, for social standing, but among especially those who were powerful, you know, having mistresses and multiple, it's just, you know, the idea that's a total upside down world. Now, again, in our world, many people, including those who espouse to be Christians, we may not live up to this ethic, but at least, you know, hardly anybody would say, no, that's just stupid. Yeah. But in the Roman world, the idea, I should love my wife? What are you talking about? What about the treatment of disadvantaged people? People who have physical problems from birth, widows, orphans. Well, again, that was kind of viewed in the Roman world. And I should say, not just the Roman world. This change in ethics didn't come about because of German tribes and their ethics. It didn't come about because of Scandinavian Viking ethics and tribes. You know, Holland makes the point. What the sort of, again, the general ethic that people may not live to, but at least sort of idealize as, well, this is how people should live, is Jesus Christ. Think about that. In terms of this 1,000-year reign. Again, 1,000 years symbolically, as opposed to 3.5 years or numbers like that. What would it symbolize? What would be the sense of 1,000 years? Well, right. One, complete. That this is the fullness. And secondly, this is a long time. You know, again, 1,000 years, I don't know it has any specific connection to literally 1,000 years, but there's a big difference in writing a number like 1,000 and a number like 3.5. And so this is a long, long time.
They're designed to make the period of suffering seem short in comparison.
Yeah, the period of Christ's reign, the period of his taking over. And so, yeah, I think we should think about 19 and this first part, 20, the reigning of these saints. Not as it all happening with the flip of the switch, but as the unfolding of Christ taking over the world and putting down enemies. And yes, new enemies rise. Satan isn't totally without power, isn't totally chained. But Satan can, just like when Jesus' lifetime, Satan's influence continues in the big picture to be overwhelmed, not in a decade, sometimes not in a lifetime, but over generations and generations. Satan, you know, often said, what's Revelation about? Well, Jesus wins. Well, yes, but this is explained to us and helping us see Jesus is winning. It's not just one battle, it's a long process. And so I think if we think about ourselves living in the reign of Christ, living where these our first century predecessors who died because of the message and their faithfulness to the message, I think that's inspiring. And I think that's why this was written. At least I think it would make sense that it would be written because of that. So again, I think the second part of chapter 20 begins to take an even longer view and get into this question of what's the final disposition of the dragon. But I've got to look at the points. And the questions come up, what about this? It refers, we've already read, well, he's going to be released for a little time. Again, I'm glad Lawrence is covering that. But you all have anything you want to add? Bill's pretty soon here. Boy, you look like you.
Okay, I wasn't going to. No, I was thinking, I was reminiscing about all of the different mouth weapons, that were used. We had, well, I have to talk fast now, but you had the beast had horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. You had the deception going on in chapter 12, and then in chapter 11, prior to that, the fire coming out of the mouths of the witnesses. And in chapter 16, the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits came out of their mouths and went out like demons, deceiving to gather them. And then in chapter 19, you got Jesus, the weapon come out of his mouth. Everything's coming from somebody's mouth, and it's all about deception from the wicked against God's people. And, it's that gospel story that's showing both sides of it through all these mouth weapons.
Thank you.